Our focus so far in the class has almost entirely been upon the motoric aspects of postural control. That is, upon understanding how muscles and joints in the body are organised to move in a way that maintains a stable balance. In this lecture we're going to look at perceptual and cognitive aspects of balance instead. The first part of today's lecture is devoted to reviewing the contributions of the different perceptual systems to postural control. We will begin by looking at how the influence of inputs from the various senses affects the organisation of steady-state balance. If you remember back to our early lecture on steady-state balance, you will recall that steady-state balance is supported by postural tone. Postural tone concerns the coordinated activation of anti-gravity muscles. Postural tone is affected by inputs from the somatosensory and vestibular systems. In the case of the somatosensory inputs, we can see that postural tone is reduced by lesions to the dorsal roots of the spinal cord. We can also see that the activation of leg extensors is increased by the stimulation of cutaneous receptors on the soles of the feet. Lastly, we can see that postural tone in the trunk and limbs is changed by head turning. This is related to the tonic neck reflex. The most dramatic illustration of the tonic neck reflex can be seen in newborns. When a baby's head is turned to one side, the arm on that side reflexively stretches out, and the opposite arm bends up at the elbow, as seen in the picture here. Okay, now let's turn to looking at the vestibular inputs. The vestibular organs of the inner ear detect information about head motion. Postural tone in the neck and limbs is changed by head turning. This time, the input is based upon information about head motion that's detected by the vestibular rather than the somatosensory system. Examples of this are the vestibular colic and vestibular spinal reflexes. The vestibular colic reflex is a compensatory response of the neck muscles when head motion is sensed by the vestibular system. This reflex generates head motion that counters the direction of movement sensed by the otoliths or semicircular canals of the vestibular system. A similar reflex is supported by the somatosensory system, the cervicocolic reflex. This reflex also produces a response in the neck muscles that acts in opposition to the direction of head motion. Unlike the vestibular colic reflex, the cervicocolic reflex is driven by neck proprioceptive inputs. The vestibular, visual, and haptic perceptual systems are each able to detect information about how the posture of the body is changing. This information can be used to regulate steady-state balance. In the next part of the lecture, we will review the basics of what we know about how body posture can be detected by the various perceptual systems. We'll start out today by looking at how the visual system detects information about body movement. As your head moves relative to the surrounding environment, optical structure is generated. For example, if I sway forwards, the movement of my head relative to the environment will produce a pattern of optic flow that looks something like the image on the right. Patterns of optic motion like this one are referred to as optic flow. Different types of optic flow contain different types of information. For example, movement of the head relative to the environment generates an optical pattern that is quite distinct from the pattern produced by the movement of objects in the environment moving relative to you. Here we see the pattern of motion that's generated when you sway forwards. There will be an optical expansion in all parts of the visual field. In other words, the optical pattern is a global one, that there's optical change everywhere in your visual field. In contrast, if part of the world is moving towards you, then that and only that part of the visual field will be expanding. The local optic flow pattern that we see here could be generated by the optical expansion that's associated with someone throwing a basketball towards you. In general, vision provides information about the position and motion of the head with respect to the surrounding environment. In the diagram here, the optic flow is generated by the change in optical structure between sitting and standing. And that change in optical structure will contain information about how I have moved relative to the surrounding objects and surfaces in this room. An important distinction in the organization of the visual system is between peripheral and foveal vision. Peripheral vision is specialized for detecting patterns of optical motion. Consequently, peripheral vision is considered more important for the regulation of body posture. Let's look at an experiment that directly manipulates the visual information for balance. In this experiment, a person stands inside a special room where the walls and ceiling of the room have been placed on wheels. This means that the experimenter can come along and can move the room either towards you or away from you when you're standing inside the room. When the room is moved towards you, a global pattern of optical motion is created. So all parts of your visual field, because you're standing in this room completely surrounded, are going to expand. It's a global pattern because the room is designed to fill up your visual field. As we talked about a few moments ago, this particular pattern of optical motion contains information about how the body is positioned and moving relative to the environment. This means that when the room is moved backwards towards the participant, that the participant perceives that they're swaying forwards towards the wall in front of them. This type of moving room can be used to understand the role of visual information in the regulation of steady-state balance. For example, one test that's been done using this apparatus is to slowly move the room rhythmically forwards and backwards while the person is standing inside it. If we have a neurologically intact adult standing in this room while the room is being continuously oscillated backwards and forwards, we will begin to see them start swaying backwards and forwards with the room oscillations. Specifically, they will sway forwards when the room is moved towards them and backwards when the room is moved away from them. If we have either a young child or an older adult standing in this room, we will notice that they end up swaying a lot more than the neurologically intact adults that we were talking about a second ago. This has been interpreted to suggest that both young children and older adults rely more on visual information in the control of their balance. In young children, the moving room has such a powerful effect that it can often cause a fall. One interpretation of these findings has been that both young children and older adults have a reduced ability to detect somatosensory information. Understanding the difference between the optical information specifying that our body has moved relative to the environment versus the optical information specifying that a part of the environment has moved relative to us is important. It allows us to understand why misperceptions can occur. When our view of the world around us is restricted, motion of an object in the world can be mistakenly perceived as motion of the body relative to the world. In this scenario, you're sitting on a train looking out of the window, and there's a train on the track next to yours that completely fills up the window that you're looking through. If the train you're looking at starts to move, it can give you the momentary sensation that you're in motion. In this next scenario, you're stuck in traffic and you're stopped behind a large truck. You're close enough to the truck that's in front of you that the truck fills up your view almost entirely. If in this situation the truck moves forwards, you can mistakenly perceive that your car is rolling backwards and you will jam your foot on the brake. I'm sure some of you have had this experience. The reason for these mistaken perceptions concerns the type of optical patterns that are being created in these particular scenarios. When the visual field is completely filled, as with the examples of the train window and the car, it's not possible to distinguish local from global outflow. In sum, These misperceptions can lead to a sense of motion even when you're not actually moving. The value of visual information for balance can be seen quite clearly as soon as we ask someone to close their eyes. Both postural sway and center of pressure movement will increase when you ask someone to close their eyes. This suggests that visual input is important for steady-state balance control. Here we see a plot of the movement of the center of pressure during a trial of steady-state balance. This particular plot is for older adults with a history of falls who are currently standing with their eyes open. The y-axis in this plot is the anterior-posterior direction of center of pressure movement, and the x-axis is the medial-lateral direction of center of pressure movement. When a person is using an ankle strategy for balance, we would expect there to be a tight relationship between the stability of their balance and how much the location of their center of pressure is moving around. This is because when you're using this particular strategy, changes in the location of the center of pressure are used to create forces that counteract the direction of body sway. Let's look at how center of pressure excursions change as a function of whether a person has their eyes open or eyes closed. In the top row, highlighted in blue, we have different recordings of people standing with their eyes open. On the bottom row, highlighted in green, we have recordings of people standing with their eyes closed. The leftmost plots are young, healthy adults, the middle plots are for older adults without a history of falls, and the rightmost plots are for older adults that have a history of falls. When you visually compare the eyes open data to the eyes closed data, you can see that there's an increase in the magnitude of center of pressure movement for all three groups. It's also evident that the elderly fallers show the biggest effect of whether vision is available or not. Understanding how a person's balance is affected by the availability of vision is useful clinically. Because of this, a measure of balance efficacy that you'll often see used in the clinic is the Romberg Quotient. The Romberg Quotient is calculated by measuring the amount of sway of the body when the eyes are closed, and then dividing it by the amount of body sway that's observed when the eyes are open. Remember, body sway is a different measurement than center of pressure excursion. Body sway is related to how the center of mass is moving. Now let's consider the role of somatosensory information in the control of balance. The somatosensory system is a complex system of sensory neurons and neural pathways that respond to changes in both the superficial and deep tissues of the body. Throughout this class, I'll be using the terms somatosensory and haptic somewhat interchangeably. So another way to phrase what we're looking at here is that we're looking at the information that's detected by the haptic perceptual system. The somatosensory system provides the central nervous system with information about the position and motion of the body with reference to supporting surfaces, and information about the relationship of various segments of the body relative to each other. These two relationships can be characterized with specific technical terms. You're probably quite familiar with the term proprioception. So proprioception is the technical term for capturing the relationship between one part of the body and another. The technical term that you might be less familiar with is X-Proprioception. X-Proprioception captures the relationship between the body in relationship to surrounding surfaces. The somatosensory system is able to detect information about the verticality of the body. In other words, it allows you to perceive the uprightness of body posture. In general, somatosensory receptors provide reliable information about verticality. However, information is less reliable when the surfaces are unstable and not level. In the modern world, most of the surfaces that we encounter are flat, rigid, and immovable. Somatosensory inputs are highly reliable on these kinds of surfaces. However, If you're in a moving vehicle, like a bus or a boat, or if you're standing on a slope, then it becomes much more challenging to perceive verticality using this particular sense. In such cases, you may need to rely on other perceptual systems to a greater degree. Let's look at some experiments that have attempted to manipulate the availability of somatosensory information for balance. Magnuson anaesthetized the pressure and joint receptors of participants' feet using a hypothermia-based technique. This manipulation significantly increased body sway. Dina et al. Used the same technique. They also anaesthetized the joint receptors and pressure receptors of the feet using hypothermia. In their study, they observed minimal consequences for how participants were able to compensate for rapid displacements. But in contrast to that finding, they observed that there were significant consequences for participants' abilities to compensate for slow platform perturbations. Specifically, in this part of the experiment, they observed an increased center of pressure motion, suggesting that compensatory postural adjustments were becoming less refined. They also observed increases in head and hip sway. An alternative method for manipulating somatosensory information, in contrast to the hypothermia-based technique we were just looking at, is using vibration. In the picture here we see what's referred to as a tactor. This little device is placed on the skin and is used to produce a very specific vibration pattern. For example, we can place a tactor over the anterior tibialis muscle. If we do this, the vibration will mechanically stimulate stretch receptors and, therefore, excite muscle spindle afferents. When we do this with the tibialis anterior, we're creating an afferent signal that would normally occur when the body is swaying backwards. The consequence of this kind of stimulation is that the central nervous system will respond to the perceived backwards body sway, perceived by the somatosensory system, by contracting the tibialis anterior. This compensation produces a forward sway. Using this vibration method, it has been shown that vibrations of eye, neck, and ankle muscles all produce directionally specific body sway. Moreover, when multiple postural control muscles are all vibrated simultaneously, the effects are additive. So this gives us insight into how the somatosensory system is being used to regulate body posture. When you place your hand on a nearby surface for balance, you're doing two things at the same time. First, you're creating an additional point of contact between your body and the environment. This will increase the base of support of the body and therefore increase the stability of standing posture. This is a change in the biomechanics of posture. The second thing that you're doing when you place your hand on a surface is creating a new source of somatosensory information. As you sway backwards and forwards, this sway will be perceived through your arm. In this second case, the potential benefit to posture is informational rather than biomechanical. Jecker ran an experiment to understand the biomechanical versus informational contributions of contacting a support surface with your hands. Here we see the apparatus that Jecker used. Participants stand with one foot in front of the other in this experiment. This makes their balance in the medial-lateral direction less stable. 3 conditions were studied. One where the hands made no contact with the adjacent support surface next to the hand. One where there was only a light touch being made. And one where a forceful touch was made between the hand and the support surface. In the light touch condition, participants were told to only lightly touch the support surface. In this condition, the absolute maximum force that was allowed to be put on the adjacent surface was 1 Newton. To give you a sense of what 1 Newton of force means, 1 Newton of force is created by the combined weight of a knife and a fork. If the subject loaded the arm and produced more than 1 Newton of force in this condition, a buzzer sounded. In the final condition, the participant was allowed to bear some of the weight of their body on the support surface to aid their balance. So, what was discovered in this research? In this graph, we're looking at the displacements of the center of pressure in the medial-lateral direction. Larger displacements of this variable are related to less stable posture. On the x-axis, we see the no-contact, light touch and force touch conditions. Within each condition, the pink bar shows the center of pressure displacements when the participant's eyes were closed, and the white bars showed the center of pressure displacements when the participant's eyes were open. If we focus on the no-contact condition, we see that center of pressure variation is much greater when participants close their eyes. In contrast, in both of the touch conditions, closing the eyes did not increase center of pressure variability. What we're seeing here is the center of pressure variation was reduced equally in both of these conditions. The implication here is that posture is stabilized by light touch just as much as it is by forceful touch. This suggests that that it's not the biomechanics of contact that's important. Instead, what matters is the somatosensory information that's created. The general conclusion from the Jecker study is that information is just as important for maintaining balance as the biomechanics of posture. When thinking about this clinically, you should realize that it's just as important to evaluate sensory capabilities as it is motor capabilities. So here we see an application of Jecker's idea, or Jecker's findings. In this research, a person is standing on a force plate that's measuring their balance control. In some conditions, they hold on to the leash of a dog that's walking on a treadmill next to them. What was observed in this research is that holding on to the leash improved balance stabilization. In this research, the movements of the leash provided additional information about how this person's body posture was changing relative to the ground. And here we have a clear example of an informational linkage rather than a force-based biomechanical linkage. The leash is not something that you can lean on in order to physically support your body. The final perceptual system that we'll consider is the vestibular perceptual system. The vestibular system provides the central nervous system with information about the position and movement of the head with respect to gravity and inertial forces. To use some technical language, it provides a gravito-inertial frame of reference. The most significant characteristic of the vestibular system when it comes to balance control is that information about the movement of the body is limited. Specifically, using vestibular inputs alone, it's difficult to distinguish between a simple head nod, so movement of the head relative to the body, and a forward hip bend, assuming that you have a similar head motion associated with each. In the case of a simple head nod, the head moves relative to a stable trunk. In the case of a hip bend, we have movement of the head in conjunction with the trunk. Let's now switch from looking at the contributions of the individual perceptual systems to beginning to understand how the information detected by the various perceptual systems can be integrated together. Daily life requires that we maintain balance in a wide variety of environments. Given our interest in understanding what makes movements functional, an important question is, how does the central nervous system organize itself to detect information for postural control under these varied conditions? An important part of the answer to this question is connected to the idea of sensory integration. So, how does the central nervous system adaptively organize information for the control of balance across varied conditions? One way to explore this question is to manipulate the availability and accuracy of the sensory inputs to steady-state standing balance, and, as a consequence of that manipulation, see how the control of posture is affected. An effective method for doing this is called Nationalist Protocol. In this protocol, a moving platform in combination with a visual surround are used to control the availability and accuracy of sensory inputs to steady-state standing balance. Here we see the 6 conditions in the protocol labelled 1 through 6. In condition 1, a person stands on a firm surface with full vision of their surroundings. In condition 2, a person stands on a firm surface with their eyes closed. In condition 3, a person stands on a firm surface while being surrounded by an enclosure that sways with them. In simple terms, the person is standing with a box on their head. In this condition, the participant can clearly see the inside of the box, that is, the inside of the box is illuminated, but the sight of the box is telling the participant nothing about how they're swaying relative to the environment. This is because the box sways with their movements. Conditions 4, 5, and 6 are the same as conditions 1, 2, and 3, with one major change. In these conditions, the person stands on a stable surface that rotates with the body. In these conditions, if a person sways forwards, then the platform will tip forwards, and if the person sways backwards, the platform will tip backwards. We can interpret these conditions with respect to changes in the availability of accurate information about the relationship between the body and the surrounding environment. For example, in condition 1, we have accurate information from the vestibular, visual, and somatosensory systems. In contrast, in condition 6, we only have accurate information from the vestibular system. We can also interpret these conditions in terms of whether or not the information from a particular perceptual system is inaccurate. In condition 3, we have inaccurate visual information. With our eyes open inside the box, vision is telling us that we are maintaining a stable distance from the surface that's in front of us. But this information is telling us nothing useful about how we're moving relative to the surrounding environment beyond the box. Similarly, in conditions 4, 5, and 6, the somatosensory system is detecting information about the relationship between the body and the tilting support surface. But because the platform is moving with body sway, we're consequently getting inaccurate information about how the body is postured relative to the ground surface. Now that we understand Nationalist Protocol, let's look at how these different conditions affect balance. On the y-axis of the graph we see here is the postural sway index. The postural sway index measures how much the body is swaying relative to the maximal sway that's possible before you have to take a protective step. A sway index greater than 100 therefore means that you've lost your steady state balance and that you have to take a step in order to prevent falling over. As we look at the amount of sway we see across these different conditions, we can see that the body sways the most when accurate information is only available from one source of information. Another takeaway message from these results is that visual, vestibular, and somatosensory systems all appear to make useful and significant contributions to steady-state balance. The moving room experiments that we encountered earlier in this lecture can provide useful insights into sensory integration processes. Earlier we learnt that the moving room can cause young children and older adults to completely lose their balance. But the effect was far smaller for healthy young adults. So in comparison to children, why does the moving room not knock young healthy adults on their asses? A basic reason for this is that although motion of the visual surroundings creates information about a change in body posture, that information is in conflict with information detected by the somatosensory system. The conflicting information detected by the somatosensory system can be used to attenuate the perturbation caused by the moving room. If the availability of somatosensory information decreases how much you're affected by the moving room, then young healthy adults may be relying on somatosensory information to a greater degree. This conclusion is consistent with other findings in the literature that suggest that older adults and children rely on vision more in controlling movement. Another possible interpretation is that young healthy adults have a greater capacity for sensory reweighting, that is, for quickly changing what sources of information they employ for regulating their balance. In situations where a particular perceptual system is not able to detect optimal or accurate information regarding the body's position in space, the central nervous system is able to modify the degree to which it relies on that information. This process is referred to as sensory reweighting. For Poturka, one of the leading researchers in this field, sensory reweighting implies that the gain on a particular sensory input will depend upon its accuracy and reliability. Thus, sensory reweighting occurs when one sensory input becomes more or less reliable, and therefore there is a change in how the different sensory inputs are relied upon. Sensory reweighting is thought to vary as a function of age, task, and environment. Let's look at an experiment that was designed to investigate sensory reweighting. In this experiment, a blindfolded participant stands on a platform that tilts up and down. In the graph, on the y-axis, we have the amount of body sway. On the x-axis, we have the amount that the platform is being tilted. A value of 0 on this axis means that there's no platform tilt, and that the platform is stable. In contrast, 8 degrees means that the platform is tilting up by about 4 degrees and down by about 4 degrees in its movements. What we see in this experiment is that when the support surface is relatively stable, in other words we have a tilt less than about 2 degrees, then body sway is equal to platform sway. In other words, as the platform tilts down, the body sways forwards. This means that the body stays aligned to the platform. The implication here is that the participant is using somatosensory information to keep the body oriented relative to the support surface. We also see that when the support surface is relatively unstable, that is, when platform tilt is greater than 2 degrees, that body sway becomes decoupled from platform sway. This suggests that the participant is now using vestibular information to orient their body's axis relative to the environment. What we're seeing here then is that when you have lots of tilting, surface orientation is becoming an unreliable source of information about how your body is aligned with respect to gravity. Poturka proposes that the primary sensory inputs for the control of balance are from the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and the graviceptive system. The visual system concerns the visual detection of body orientation with respect to the visual environment. The proprioceptive system concerns the haptic detection of body orientation with respect to the support surface, and the graviceptive system concerns the vestibular detection of body orientation with respect to the line of action of gravity. Poturka proposed that balance control depends upon the relative contributions of these three systems. We can see this relative contribution represented as the sum of weightings. Here, W subscript V is the relative weighting of the visual system, W subscript P is the relative weighting of the proprioceptive system, so the haptic perceptual system, and W subscript G is the relative weighting of the graviceptive system, or vestibular inputs. We can use Poturka's simple model of the relative weightings of visual proprioceptive and graviceptive systems to interpret what is happening in the platform tilt experiment. In this experiment, the participant is blindfolded. This means that there's no contribution of vision, so we can set W subscript V equal to 0. In the graph, we see what happens to the contributions of the vestibular and proprioceptive systems. When the platform tilt is small and the ground is relatively stable, then more reliance is placed on the proprioceptive system, and the value of W subscript G is higher. As the ground becomes less stable, W subscript G increases and W subscript P decreases. Based upon Peterka's research, for young healthy adults that are standing on a stable surface with a good base of support, within a well-lit room with their eyes open, the relative contribution of vision is only about 10%. The relative contribution of proprioception is about 70%, and the relative contribution of the graviceptive inputs is about 20%. A clear takeaway from this research is that healthy young adults rely heavily on somatosensory information, and minimally on visual and graviceptive information. Another finding of this research is that if a visual surround is moved in a way that conflicts with other perceptual systems, then the relative contribution of vision will decrease. What we have here is the situation of the moving room. In this particular case, we should expect that the relative contribution of vision, W subscript V, will get lower and lower as the amount of oscillation of the moving room gets larger and larger. Lastly, Peterka's research reveals that when a healthy young adult stands on an unstable surface, that they will increase the relative weightings of the vestibular and visual inputs, and they will decrease their dependence on somatosensory inputs. Research by Goodworth shows that the use of perceptual information to regulate balance is task-specific. When Goodworth had participants stand with a narrow stance, he observed that there was a strong reliance on proprioceptive, vestibular and visual information to orient the body to upright. In contrast, when participants adopted a wider stance, there was a decreased reliance on visual information. In this particular condition, the wide stance increases the biomechanical stability of posture. This means that information from the senses is not needed as much to regulate posture. This stable stance then frees up vision to be involved in other functions. Let's look at another example of how the relative contributions of the different perceptual systems become adaptively reorganized. Here we're going to consider the sensory reweighting that takes place during the learning of a novel balance task. Here participants learn to stand on one leg while holding a bag. In this research, the relative weighting of vision was investigated by moving the visual surroundings, as with the moving room experiments. In the initial stages of learning in this task, there was a much stronger reliance on visual information. Participants struggled to stand in the new stance with their eyes closed, and movements of the visual surroundings, i.e. moving the moving room, destabilized balance. In the later, more automatic stages of motor learning, there was a decrease in the reliance on visual information, and a corresponding increase in the reliance on somatosensory information. Here, the movements of the visual surroundings had a far smaller impact on balance. The results of this research are consistent with the idea that visual proprioception normally plays a lead role in tuning up ankle-foot proprioception and muscular control. How do we begin to understand why a particular pattern of sensory reweighting might be observed in a particular situation? One way to answer this question is with the idea that different perceptual systems have different relative specializations when it comes to detecting information for the control of balance. Another way to phrase this is that different perceptual systems can be thought to be taking on distinct functional roles when it comes to the control of balance. If we look again at the results from the Peterka experiment we were looking at earlier, we can try to understand these results based upon the idea that different perceptual systems are specialized for detecting different types of information. Here we see that the somatosensory system preferentially encodes low amplitude and low frequency information about the position of the body relative to the platform. This information is what allows the subject to maintain their postural alignment with respect to the surface, even as it tilts. In this second region of the graph, we see that the vestibular and visual systems are preferentially encoding information about large, rapid changes. In other words, the vestibular and visual systems are specialized for high frequency and high amplitude information, in contrast to the somatosensory system, which has been specialized for low amplitude and low frequency information. When we look into the literature, we find further evidence regarding the particular specializations or functional roles that are played by the various perceptual systems that contribute to balance control. Vestibular and visual information is believed to help establish a stable reference point or reference frame for interpreting the movements of the body that are registered by the somatosensory system. These distinct roles of the different perceptual systems means that a loss of vestibular information or a loss of visual information by closing the eyes does not alter the delay or directional specificity of postural responses, but it will cause the magnitude of the evoked muscle activity to increase. In contrast, loss of somatosensory neurons that provide kinesthetic information about the body segments will cause gross postural deficits and can greatly increase the postural response delay. When a person enters a new environment, the perceptual systems detect information about the properties of that environment that are relevant to the control of action. If there is a table, the table is perceived as something that is solid and something that could be grabbed onto. If there is a solid floor, the floor is perceived as a step-onable and walk-onable surface. This kind of knowledge represents a map of the affordances of the environment. In the context of reactive balance, information about postural affordances is not obtained after the perturbation to balance has occurred. We can think about this in the context of the moving room. In the context of the moving room experiment, a person walks into the moving room, often believing that the walls that surround them are solid walls. They consequently perceive these surfaces as parts of the environment that they can rely upon to control their balance. Visual information is especially important when a change in support strategy is required. This is because visual information regarding environmental affordances is a crucial determinant of whether or not these strategies can be used. For example, visual information is needed to perceive whether a particular part of the ground that surrounds a person is safe to step onto. Visual information is also needed to perceive if a particular nearby surface is grasp-onable, and therefore can act as a handhold. Next, let's look at the role of somatosensory information in the control of reactive balance. Somatosensory information is believed to be especially important for rapidly responding to surface perturbations. The importance of somatosensory information is related to the associated muscle response latencies. Somatosensory information that specifies perturbations to balance typically yields reactive responses in about 80 to 100 milliseconds. In contrast, visual information specifying perturbations to balance yield much slower reactive responses that clock in at around about 200 milliseconds. Changes in the somatosensory information for reactive balance have been shown to affect the selection of reactive balance strategies. In this study, by Horek et al., somatosensory inputs were impaired by using a blood pressure cuff. The blood pressure cuff induced partial anesthesia of the ankle joints. The reduced ankle proprioception shifted participants from using an ankle strategy to using a hip strategy when they were attempting to recover their balance. A straightforward prediction to follow from this is that individuals affected by peripheral neuropathy would be more likely to use a hip strategy. Next, let's consider the role of the vestibular system in regulating reactive balance. The contribution of the vestibular system has been investigated by studying the responses to different types of physical perturbations. In one case, the posture of the whole body was perturbed, and in the other case, just the head was perturbed. The whole body was perturbed in this research by shifting the platform under a participant's feet. This led to the body swaying in the direction opposite to the platform shift. The head was perturbed using a special contraption that accelerated a weight attached to the side of each participant's head. Here we see the mass being pulled backwards. This produces a forward sway of the head. When the body is perturbed, the sway of the body generates somatosensory information about body motion. When just the head is perturbed, vestibular information is generated about the motion of the head relative to the environment. In this manipulation, we also have somatosensory information about the motion of the head relative to the body. The two distinct manipulations in this experiment, of either perturbing the body or perturbing the head, were found to be effective in selectively affecting body motion. Here we see the body movements that result from the body perturbation manipulation. The dotted line at 0 shows the time point at which the perturbation was applied. When we look at the bottom, we can see the motion of the platform. This perturbation clearly influences the hip and ankle ankles and the centre of mass location. We also see at the top that there's minimal motion of the head relative to the body, resulting from this particular perturbation. Here we see the body movements that result from the head perturbation manipulation. At the bottom we can see the motion of the weight attached to the head, and we can see that this perturbation creates a motion of the head relative to the neck, but minimal motion of the body. Now that we understand the manipulations, let's look at how these different manipulations affected muscle recruitment patterns. On the left, we see the muscle activations following the body perturbation manipulation. On the right, we see the muscle activations following the head perturbation manipulation. The main thing to notice in these graphs is that the muscle activations that follow from the head perturbation manipulation were about 10 times smaller than those that followed the body perturbation manipulation. This finding, that the postural muscle responses evoked from head motion were far smaller than those evoked by body motion, has the implication that the contribution of the vestibular system to reactive balance is much smaller than that of the somatosensory inputs. The study we just considered suggests that the contribution of the vestibular system to reactive balance control is quite minimal. Based upon the systems model, this does not mean that the contribution of the vestibular system is always minimal. It only means that the contribution is minimal in the context of constraints that we just looked at. As you might expect, based upon what we have learnt in the class so far, with other types of perturbations, the contribution of the visual system can be much more significant. Here we see a situation studied by Allen. In this research, the support surface is tilted rather than translated. In the tilt shown here, the gastroc is stretched and activated. Allen observed that the compensatory stabilizing response in the tibialis anterior was activated by information from both the vestibular and visual systems, and that when the eyes were closed, the vestibular system made about an 80% relative contribution. Thus, we see that the contribution of the somatosensory system decreases as soon as the ground surface no longer has a stable orientation relative to the line of action of gravity. For the final part of our introduction to the control of posture, let's look at how cognitive factors affect balance. In everyday, real-world situations, Postural control is adapted to multiple co-acting task constraints. Here we see the seemingly simple situation of a person reading a book at a bus stop. This situation is comprised of multiple tasks. This person needs to maintain their upright stance. Most importantly, they need to control their balance in a way that means that they will not fall forwards into the road. They also need to stabilize their posture in a way that allows for them to read the words on the page of their book. Most everyday tasks look like this. There are multiple tasks that all need to be satisfied at the same time. When we start thinking about cognitive systems in postural control, the first thing that we need to realize is that the tasks or subtasks each require cognitive resources. Cognitive resources are information processing resources that are required to complete a task. For example, if we look at our guy that's at the bus stop, if he directs too much of his attentional resources at his book, he may not hear the bus coming and may forget to flag it down. He may also not notice that there's a dog that's just laid down behind him, and therefore trip over when the bus arrives. The idea that there is competition for cognitive resources is commonly talked about in terms of dual task interference, although a better term might be multitask interference, given the multiple tasks that are encountered in real-world situations. The basic idea of dual task interference is that whenever you have more than one task to do at the same time, it's possible that those tasks are going to interfere with one another. The central idea here is that cognitive resources are limited. When multiple tasks are being performed, that means that competition for resources can impact performance on the various tasks. An important point to grasp here is that cognitive resources are used by motor and perceptual activities as well as more mental activities. It's tempting to think about cognitive resources as only being related to tasks such as remembering a shopping list or trying to understand what someone is telling you. But as we will see, basic actions such as attempting to maintain an upright posture do require cognitive resources. Let's look at some of the research that suggests that the task of maintaining an upright stance does require cognitive resources. Kerr investigated a dual tasking situation where participants had to perform a postural task and a cognitive task at the same time. Participants either performed the non-challenging balance task of sitting in a chair without falling out of the chair, or the more challenging balance task of standing upright with one foot placed in front of the other with their eyes closed without falling over. The cognitive task that Kerr investigates involves a spatial memory task. Participants were asked to visualize a matrix of numbers in their head. The task was to add numbers to the matrix as they were given to them by the experimenter. The participants had to remember the positions of the numbers in the matrix as well as the numbers themselves. For example, the experimenter might say, put the number 5 in the top left slot of the matrix, and then you would have to visualize the matrix and put that particular number in that particular slot in the matrix. When we look at participants' ability to accurately perform the matrix memorization task, we see that the number of errors depends upon the balance task that's being performed while they're attempting to perform the cognitive task. When participants perform the challenging balance task, the number of errors in the memory for the matrix increase substantially. The implication here is that postural control uses up cognitive resources. The more challenging balance task requires more attention, and this draws attention away from the spatial memory task. The term cognitive resources captures many different things. It turns out that the task of controlling posture utilizes specific types of cognitive resources. Let's now look at what happens in Kerr's dual tasking experiment when we consider different types of cognitive tasks. First, we have the spatial memory task that we just described. In this task, participants have to remember not just the numbers, but how the numbers are arranged spatially. In the non-spatial memory task, participants alternatively had to memorize a series of sentences and then repeat them back word for word. Importantly, there's no spatial dimension to what you have to do in this memory task. Here we see the results. On the y-axis, we have the number of recall errors. Recall errors are either incorrect entries in the matrix or incorrect memory of the words from the heard sentences. Notice that the increase in errors we see when the balance task is much harder only occurs for the spatial memory task. Changing from the simple balance task of sitting to the harder balance task has no effect in the context of the non-spatial memory task. The implication here is that postural control utilizes visual spatial processing resources. Now, let's look in more detail at how cognitive demands for postural control vary as a function of the type of postural task being performed. We just saw that sitting is less cognitively demanding than tandem stance standing. Let's expand upon this distinction and look at an array of tasks that represent a progression of task difficulty. Sitting at the top is very biomechanically stable, since the posture of the body is supported by the chair. At the other end of the continuum we have walking. Note, we're looking at two parts of walking here, in the bottom two entries. Walking during the double support phase and walking during the single support phase. In the double support phase, both feet are on the ground, and in that particular moment the base of support is larger and balance is more stable. In the single support phase, you're basically balancing on one leg, and you're in the process of falling forwards. So let's look at how performing these various postural tasks impacts the ability to concurrently perform a cognitive task. The cognitive task studied here is an auditory reaction time task. In this task, when you hear a sound, you simply have to say the word top as quickly as you can. Here we see the results. On the y-axis, we have the amount of time it takes after hearing the sound to say the word top. We see that the amount of time taken to mentally react to a sound increases with how challenging the postural task is. The implication here is that more cognitive resources are required when the demands of the postural control task is increased. As with all of the research that you learn about in this class, it's important to think about how the results we're looking at here apply to real-world settings. Let's replace the auditory signal that's being studied in this experiment with the specific sound of tires screeching, and the saying of the word top out loud, with the organising of an action to get out of the way of a car that's hurtling towards you. In this context, we can see that changes in the postural control task have significant real-world functional implications. The systems model predicts that the functionality of behaviour depends upon the complex interaction of relevant constraints. When we look at the constraints of the individual, we have motor, perceptual, and cognitive constraints. A basic application of this model to our present concerns is that we should expect cognition to be affected by informational constraints, in addition to the biomechanical stability constraints that we just considered on the previous slide. Basically, we should expect that the cognitive demands for controlling posture should vary as a function of the availability of reliable orienting information. Here we see the apparatus that's used to create the conditions of the Nationalist Protocol. Using this apparatus, we can manipulate the biomechanical stability and the reliability of the information detected by the senses. In this research, experimenters also manipulated the cognitive tasks being performed. Participants pressed a button as soon as they could after either seeing a light coming on or hearing a sound. Let's look at the results of this experiment. On the y-axis, we have reaction time. The red bars are the time it takes to react to the light coming on, the white bars are the time it takes to react to the sound. The x-axis has the different postural conditions. On the left, we have the postural task, where the participants are most biomechanically stable, and they also have very accurate information about body posture from all of the perceptual systems. On the rightmost condition, we see that the participants are in a condition where both the floor and the visual surrounds sway with them. This makes both visual and somatosensory information about the posture of the body relative to the environment unreliable. What we see in these results is that cognitive tasks can be performed better when your perceptual systems provide more reliable measurements of the relationship between your body and the environment, or more specifically, the relationship between your body and the vertical line of gravity. In other words, when more accurate somatosensory and visual orienting information are available, less cognitive resources are going to be needed. Over the past few slides, we have seen how the task of controlling the posture of the body requires cognitive resources. We've seen this by looking at research that shows that a person's ability to perform a cognitive task is affected by the specifics of the posture task that's being performed. The real-world implication of this research is that a person can become impaired in their ability to perform cognitive tasks when the demands of the task of maintaining upright stance of their body is increased by biomechanical instability and informational instability. In the real world, this might mean that a person takes longer to notice a functionally important feature of the environment, like a sign that warns about the floor being wet. Let's now go and look at how different cognitive tasks affect our ability to control upright stance. For example, if we're given the task of memorizing items on a shopping list, is that likely to impair our balance? Or if we're given the cognitively demanding task of walking into a new environment and perceiving the properties of that environment that might be relevant to the regulation of action, is our balance likely to become impaired? We're about to look at a research study by Huxhold. This research provides useful insights into the impact of cognitive task performance on the control of posture. It shows that the impact of a cognitive task on postural control depends upon the complexity of the task that's being performed, as well as a person's age. Huxhold investigated 4 cognitive tasks that ranged in difficulty. The simplest task just involved watching digits appear on a screen in front of the participant. The next task involved watching digits appear on a screen and pressing a response button when a certain digit appeared on the screen. For example, you should press the button if you see either the number 1, 2, or 3. The next task required that participants listen to a sequence of single digits being said aloud. In this task, participants were required to press a response button if the number they just heard was the same as the number before last. In the last task, participants watched a sequence of grids appear on the screen in front of them. When each grid appeared, a red dot was visible in one of the 8 white squares. Participants were asked to press the response button if the position of the red dot that they just saw was the same as the position of the red dot in the grid that was presented the one before last. As we move from left to right across these 4 tasks, we see an increase in the cognitive task demands. On the right side, we have much lower working memory demands, and on the right side, we have much higher working memory demands. Let's look at how these tasks influenced balance. On the y-axis of this plot, we have a measure of the magnitude of displacements of the centre of pressure. This measure captures the centre of pressure displacements both in the anterior-posterior direction and in the medial-lateral direction at the same time. Larger values of centre of pressure area, which is this measure, are related to less stable posture. On the x-axis, we have the different conditions that vary in their cognitive task demands. In the first condition on the left, there's no cognitive task. In this condition, participants were just asked to stand while looking directly at a cross in the screen on a screen in front of them. In the next 4 conditions, we have the conditions that we introduced on the previous slide. The thin grey line in the plot shows data for younger adults. We see that they have much lower centre of pressure displacements compared to older adults. When we compare the different conditions, we see something slightly surprising. The centre of pressure displacement magnitudes are largest for the condition where there are no cognitive task demands. Let's now focus on the data points for older adults that were found in this study. These are shown with the thick black line at the top. Here we see an exaggerated version of the pattern of results we saw for younger adults. The centre of pressure displacement magnitudes are largest when there is either no cognitive task demands or high cognitive task demands, and they're smallest when there's a moderate level of cognitive task demands. We can describe this type of data as a U-shaped function. Balance is impaired when there is almost no cognitive task demands, balance is improved when there's some cognitive task demands, and balance is impaired again when there are high cognitive task demands. What we're seeing here is that there are some cases where the presence of a secondary or dual cognitive task can actually improve performance. So how do we explain this quite curious finding, where we're seeing that doing a cognitive task while standing can actually improve balance? Huxhold et al. Interpret their finding in the following way. In the single task condition, where participants have no secondary cognitive task, they propose that the participants are directing their attention towards what would normally be a highly automatic process. We do not normally consciously focus on the act of standing up while we're standing up. And, as the motor learning literature suggests, doing this may actually reduce the efficacy of postural control mechanisms. This is like someone coming along and telling you, please stand still. And as soon as they do this, you're going to start focusing on trying to keep yourself from swaying. In the dual task conditions, by having participants focus on a simple secondary task, like simply watching digits on a screen in front of them, you start directing attention towards the secondary task, and you may be therefore improving the automaticity and efficacy of the postural control processes. Anderson et al. Propose a slightly different way of thinking about these findings. They propose that a heightened arousal caused by performing a secondary task might, in turn, act to improve performance. This wraps up our review of the foundations of postural control.